There are places in this country, deep in the folded, ancient hills of Appalachia, where the roads give out and the silence becomes a presence. These are hollows that history has forgotten, or perhaps has willfully chosen to ignore. It was to one such place, a town called Redemption Hollow, that Arthur Vance came in the late summer of 1925. He was a young man from Boston, an archivist by trade, accustomed to the scent of decaying paper and the quiet order of cataloged history. He was not prepared for the living decay of Redemption Hollow. The town sat in the bottom of a basin, perpetually shadowed by the surrounding peaks, as if cupped in a great, indifferent hand. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and something else, something faintly metallic and sweet, like old blood. He had inherited the property of a great-uncle he'd never known, the last of his family's branch to cling to these hills. His purpose was simple, clinical: to assess the ramshackle farmhouse and its few untamed acres, liquidate the asset, and return to the civilized world of documented fact. The house itself was a testament to a slow, agonizing surrender. It leaned into the hillside, as if exhausted, its porch sighing under the weight of its own roof. The paint was a memory, flaked away to reveal the gray, weathered bones of the wood beneath. Inside, the air was a sealed tomb of stale time. Every surface was coated in a fine, gray dust that seemed to absorb the light. Arthur moved through the rooms with a handkerchief pressed to his mouth, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive quiet. It was in the attic that the house's true nature seemed to concentrate. The heat was a physical blow, a suffocating blanket woven from trapped sunlight and the dust of a century. Here, under the low, slanted roof, lay the detritus of a forgotten life. A rusted birdcage, a child's single, scuffed shoe, stacks of brittle newspapers whose headlines screamed of a world long dead. In the farthest corner, tucked beneath a mound of moth-eaten quilts, sat a small, cedar chest bound with iron straps. It was locked. A professional instinct, a historian's curiosity, overrode his desire to flee the suffocating space. He found a rusted tire ironed downstairs and, with a guilty splintering of wood, forced the lock. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed linen, was a single object, a small leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth by the passage of a thumb. A diary. There was no name, only a date embossed on the cover, 1888. He sat on the dusty floorboards, the sweat beading on his brow, and opened it. The script was a farmer's scrawl, surprisingly neat, the ink faded from black to a rusty brown. The first few entries were mundane, a litany of rural life. April 12th, planted the beans. Rain threatens. The soil is stubborn this year. May 3rd, mended the south fence. A fox has been at the chickens again. Arthur almost dismissed it as a simple record of agricultural toil. But as he read on, a strange and unsettling thread began to emerge. The farmer, a man named Silas Croft, wrote not just of crops and livestock, but of a different kind of harvest. June 20th, one entry read, "Another drifter passed through today, heading for the mines. Thin fellow, but strong-backed. He will not reach the mines. He has found a different sort of work." Arthur's blood ran cold, the oppressive heat of the attic forgotten. This was not a farmer's ledger. It was something else entirely. He turned the page, and the narrative deepened, the prosaic tone acquiring a chilling, matter-of-fact cruelty that spoke of a profound and terrifying darkness hiding in plain sight. The diary became an obsession. Arthur abandoned his initial survey of the property, the legal papers and deeds lying forgotten on the dusty kitchen table. He spent his days inside the decaying farmhouse, the windows shut against the peering eyes he felt from the surrounding woods, and his nights reading by the unsteady flicker of a kerosene lamp. The world of Silas Croft, dead for decades, became more real to him than the unsettling present of Redemption Hollow. The prosaic entries about weather and crops were interspersed with a far more sinister accounting. Silas wrote of men and women who appeared at his farm, drawn by rumor of work or simply lost in the winding, unmarked trails of the mountains. He described them with the detached eye of a livestock trader. July 9th, a girl from the low country. no more than 16. Said she was running from a cruel father. She has found a new one now. The words were plain, unadorned, and in their simplicity lay their horror. There was no gloating, no confession of evil, only the calm, procedural notation of a man engaged in a gruesome, yet ordinary, business. Driven by a gnawing need to understand, Arthur ventured into the town. Redemption Hollow was little more than a single dirt road lined with a handful of buildings, a general store, a post office, and a white steepled church that seemed to be the only structure defying the general state of decay. When he asked about Silas Croft, a veil dropped. The friendly, if reserved, curiosity of the storekeeper turned to a guarded blankness. The man simply shook his head, muttering that it was a name he hadn't heard in his lifetime. At the post office, the clerk, a woman with eyes as gray as the perpetual mountain haze, claimed the name meant nothing to her, all while her hands trembled slightly as she sorted the mail. It was a conspiracy of silence, as thick and suffocating as the valley's fog. They knew. He could see it in the way they averted their gaze, in the sudden halt of conversation as he approached. He was an outsider, and he was asking about a secret they had buried long ago. The true resistance came in the form of Jedediah Thorne. He was the town patriarch, a man whose family owned the sawmill, the general store, and, it was said, the souls of most of the residents. Thorne was a large man, broad and solid, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the mountain itself. He found Arthur on the porch of the Croft farmhouse one evening, appearing not with a shout but as a sudden, silent presence. He did not issue a direct threat. His menace was more subtle, wrapped in the guise of paternal concern. He spoke of the dangers of digging up old roots, how some ground was best left fallow. "This is a quiet place, Mr. Vance," Thorne had said, his voice a low rumble. "We keep to ourselves. We respect the dead by letting them rest." His eyes, however, held no respect. They held a cold, proprietary warning. Arthur understood. This wasn't just a town's reluctance to recall an unpleasant past. It was an active, enforced amnesia. Jedediah Thorne was its guardian. Arthur felt a new kind of chill, one that had nothing to do with the cool mountain night. The diary was not just a historical artifact. It was a living threat. The silence was not empty. It was a shield. And as Thorne turned and walked away, his heavy form swallowed by the encroaching twilight, Arthur knew he was no longer just an archivist assessing a property. He was an intruder, and he was getting dangerously close to the heart of the town's rotten secret. Returning to the lamplit solitude of the farmhouse, Arthur felt a surge of defiance. Jedediah Thorne's veiled threats had not intimidated him. They had confirmed his suspicions. The silence was a lock, and the diary was the key. He would not be deterred. He opened the leather-bound book again, his fingers tracing the spidery script with a new intensity. He was no longer just a reader. He was an investigator, searching for a pattern in the madness. Silas Croft's entries grew bolder, more detailed, as the year 1888 wore on. The pretense of farming fell away, replaced by the stark reality of his true trade. He was a human trafficker, a predator who used the isolation of his land as a trap. But the diary was more than a record of his victims. It was a business ledger. He mentioned payments, transactions, deliveries. He never named his client, referring to them only as the benefactors or the old family. A cold dread washed over Arthur as he realized the implication. Croft was not working alone. His monstrosity was not an isolated act of a deranged individual. It was a service rendered for a powerful, hidden entity. It was then that he found the reference that would change the course of his search. In an entry dated September 2nd, Silas wrote, "The girl from the low country grew troublesome. Her spirit was too strong, not suited for the benefactor's particular needs. Took her to the Sorrow Spring. The spring quiets them all in the end." The Sorrow Spring. The name was chilling, poetic in its grimness. It sounded like a piece of local folklore, a name whispered in ghost stories. But in Silas's hand, it was a place of finality, a disposal site. Was it a real place? Or some macabre metaphor? Arthur frantically flipped through the remaining pages, his heart pounding. The final dozen pages were blank. He almost closed the book in frustration, but a thought made him pause. He ran his fingers along the inside of the back cover. There, pasted to the worn leather, was a brittle, folded piece of paper. He carefully worked it loose with the tip of a knife. As he unfolded it, his breath caught in his throat. It was a map, a crude, hand-drawn map of the Croft property and the surrounding woods. It showed the farmhouse, the barn, the creek that ran along the western edge of the land. And there, deep in the thicket of trees behind the house, was a small X next to a handwritten label, Sorrow Spring. The map was a revelation. It transformed the diary from a confession into a guide. The horror was not confined to the ink and paper. It was etched into the land itself. The spring, the cellar, the woods, they were all part of a vast, unhallowed grave. The secrets of Redemption Hollow were not just buried in the past. They were buried in the soil. Arthur stared at the map, the kerosene lamp casting a dancing, monstrous shadow of his own hand on the wall. He now held tangible proof. He had a destination. The warnings of Jedediah Thorne echoed in his mind, no longer sounding like folksy wisdom, but like the desperate plea of a man guarding a tomb. Arthur knew that to follow this map was to cross a threshold, to step out of the realm of historical inquiry and into the physical heart of the crime. The thought was terrifying, but the faces of the nameless victims described in the diary, the thin drifter, the girl with the strong spirit, rose in his mind. They were not just entries in a ledger. They were people whose stories ended in this dark valley. He owed it to them to find the place where they were silenced. The town's wall of silence was impenetrable. Every door was closed to him, every face a mask of calculated ignorance. Arthur knew that to find the truth behind the Sorrow Spring, he could not rely on the complicit heart of Redemption Hollow. He needed to seek out its margins, to find someone who lived outside the grasp of Jedediah Thorne's influence. There was one name he had heard, whispered with a mixture of fear and pity at the general store: Elspeth. She was a recluse, an old woman who lived in a secluded cabin on the far side of the valley, a place the townspeople avoided. They called her a healer, a crone, a witch. They said she remembered things best forgotten. She was the town's living archive of unwanted memories, and Arthur knew he had to speak with her. He found her cabin after a long walk along a path that was little more than a deer trail. It was a small, surprisingly neat dwelling, with smoke curling from a stone chimney and rows of drying herbs hanging from the eaves. An old woman sat on the porch in a rocking chair, her hands busy with a piece of mending. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and startlingly blue. She watched him approach without a word, her gaze steady and unreadable. "Elspeth?" Arthur asked, his voice feeling loud and intrusive in the profound quiet of the woods. She simply nodded, her eyes flicking down to the leather-bound diary he held in his hand. A flicker of something, recognition, sorrow, passed through her expression. "You have found Silas Croft's Book of Sorrows," she said, her voice dry and rustling like autumn leaves. It was not a question. Arthur was taken aback. "You know of this diary?" he asked. She gave a small, humorless smile. "Some stories don't need to be written down to be known. They seep into the soil. They poison the water. Silas Croft was a poisoner of this valley." She beckoned him to sit on the porch steps. For the first time since arriving, Arthur felt he could breathe. Here, away from the suffocating judgment of the town, the truth felt possible. He did not need to press her. The sight of the diary had unlocked a memory she seemed willing, or perhaps compelled, to share. She did not speak of the horrors directly. Her storytelling was elusive, a tapestry of folklore and grim reality. She spoke of the old family, the Thornes, and how their roots in the valley were deeper and darker than anyone knew. She said their prosperity was not built on lumber, but on a blood tithe paid by the unfortunate. Silas Croft, she explained, her voice dropping to a whisper, was their dog. He fetched for them. He brought them strays and wanderers, those who would not be missed. He thought his service bought him safety. He was a fool. She looked at him then, her blue eyes piercing. The Sorrow Spring is a real place. It's a wound in the earth. The water runs deep and cold, and it holds secrets. But the spring itself is not the end. It's a marker. You are looking for what lies beneath. Her words confirmed Arthur's darkest fears. The spring was not just a disposal site. It was a landmark for something worse. What lies beneath? Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elspeth's gaze drifted towards the oppressive peaks that ringed the valley. Silas was a farmer. He knew how to use a root cellar, not just for potatoes and preserves. Some harvests need to be kept fresh. The implication was monstrous. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. He had come here seeking answers, and this old woman, the town pariah, had given him a truth more terrible than he could have imagined. As he stood to leave, Elspeth placed a bony hand on his arm. Be careful, boy from the city. The thorns are still the kings of this hollow. They buried their history once. They will not hesitate to bury you with it. Elspeth's words echoed in Arthur's mind as he walked the long path back to the Croft farm, the air growing thick and heavy with the promise of a thunderstorm. Some harvests need to be kept fresh. The phrase circled him, a vulture of a thought. He now understood that the diary was not the full story, but merely the prologue. The true narrative was written in the earth, in a place marked by a sorrowful spring and a hidden cellar. Back in the oppressive confines of the farmhouse, he lit the lamp and spread the diary and the map on the table. He looked at Silas Croft's neat, methodical script with new eyes. He was not just reading the words of a monster, but of a functionary, a cog in a much larger, more terrible machine. The benefactors, the old family, it was all the Thorns. The family that now presented itself as the moral and economic bedrock of Redemption Hollow had built its dynasty on a foundation of human suffering. Elspeth had called Silas their dog. He had fetched for them. The diary was his logbook of procurement. Arthur traced the entries, and the cold, economic language now took on a terrifying specificity. October 5th, a family of 3 heading west claimed their farm had failed. The father was strong, the mother hardy. The boy was small, but the benefactors are not always particular about age. A good price for the lot. November 11th, a salesman of patent medicines. A talkative sort. His wares were useless, but his flesh was sound. The old family values silence above all. Each entry was a death sentence, signed and dated. Arthur felt a surge of righteous fury, not just at Silas, but the generations of Thorns who had profited from this horror and then cloaked themselves in piety and respectability. Jedediah Thorn's grandstanding about letting the dead rest was the height of cynical hypocrisy. They wanted the dead to rest because their own legacy was built upon their bones. For the first time, a name from the present appeared in the old tea. The woods behind the Croft farm were a labyrinth of shadow and sound. Rain sluiced through the canopy, turning the forest floor into a treacherous mire of mud and slick, decaying leaves. Arthur's lantern cast a small, frantic circle of light that seemed only to deepen the surrounding darkness. The wind howled through the ancient trees, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. He held the crude map, now damp and fragile, shielding it with his body as he pushed deeper into the wilderness, following the faint outline of the creek that Silas Croft had drawn decades ago. The journey was an ordeal. Thorny vines snagged his coat, and unseen roots threatened to trip him at every step. The air grew colder, the scent of rain and wet earth mingling with the same foul, stagnant odor he had first noticed in the valley. It was stronger here, a cloying sweetness that coated the back of his throat. After what felt like an eternity, the terrain began to slope downward into a small, secluded hollow. The trees grew denser, their limbs draped in moss, creating a natural amphitheater of gloom. In the center of this hollow, as the map had promised, was the Sorrow Spring. It was not a gushing fountain, but a placid, almost black pool of water, its surface disturbed only by the relentless drumming of the rain. An unnatural stillness hung over the place, and Arthur felt an instinctual dread, a primal fear of sacred, violated ground. This was where the girl with the strong spirit was quieted. This was the terminus for so many lost souls. But Elspeth had said the spring was only a marker. His eyes scanned the perimeter of the pool, his lantern beam cutting through the gloom. And then he saw it. Tucked against the base of the hollow's steep-sided wall, almost completely consumed by overgrown briars and collapsed earth, was a low, dark shape. A set of weathered wooden doors set almost horizontally into the ground. A root cellar. It was exactly as Elspeth had described. The doors were made of thick, heavy planks, gray and splintered with age, and held shut by a massive, rust-eaten iron bar laid across them and bracketed into the earth. It was barred from the outside. A prison. A tomb. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He stood before the physical manifestation of Silas Croft's diary. This was the place where the fiction of the ledger met the fact of the grave. He dropped the lantern and seized the shovel, his hands clumsy in the cold and rain. He used the shovel's edge as a lever, jamming it beneath the heavy iron bar. The metal groaned in protest, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet hollow. He put all his weight into it, his muscles straining. With a final, sickening crack of splintering wood, the brackets gave way, and the iron bar fell into the mud with a heavy thud. The doors were free. For a long moment, he simply stood there, breathing heavily, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He was afraid. He was terrified of what he would find in the darkness below. The secrets of the diary were one thing, words on a page, abstracted by time. But the reality waiting for him in that cellar was another thing entirely. Steeling himself, he gripped the iron ring on one of the doors and pulled. It resisted, swollen with decades of damp, but then moved with a low, groaning compla as the door lifted. A wave of air washed over him from the opening. It was a smell of profound corruption, of damp soil, of rot, and of something else, something uniquely, terribly human. It was the smell of old, forgotten death, and it was overwhelming. Arthur recoiled, gagging, the foul air from the cellar a physical assault. The stench was ancient, a layered miasma of despair and decay. He stumbled back, his foot slipping in the mud, and he fell to one knee, the lantern casting a wild, lurching light across the scene. He could not bring himself to look into that black maw. Not yet. He needed more than just courage. He needed the complete and total truth. The story felt incomplete. There was a missing piece, a final act he had not yet uncovered. He scrambled back to his feet, slammed the cellar door shut, and fled the hollow. He ran blindly through the woods, the branches whipping his face, driven by a desperate need to put distance between himself and that place of finality. Back in the relative sanctuary of the farmhouse, soaking wet and trembling, he did not bother to change his clothes. He went straight to the diary, his hands shaking as he turned the pages. He had read it through, but he felt he must have missed something. He reread the final dozen entries, the ones detailing the last transactions of 1888. The methodical, dispassionate tone he had grown accustomed to was still there, but as he neared the end, a new element crept in. A subtle shift, a hint of anxiety. The last recorded entry was dated December 10th. It was short, delivered the last of the autumn stock. The benefactors are hungry. Their needs are growing. They asked about my own family. I told them I have none. After that, the pages were blank, or so he had thought. As he stared at the empty page following the December 10th entry, he noticed something. A faint indentation, a ghostly impression of writing from the other side of the page, which he had assumed was just bleed through from the next leaf. But the next leaf was also blank. His heart began to pound. He angled the book towards the lamplight, his eyes straining. The pages were stuck together at the very edge. With the delicate touch of an archivist, he used the tip of his knife to carefully separate them. He had not reached the end of the diary after all. There were two final pages, glued together by time and damp, and the writing on them was utterly transformed. The neat, controlled script was gone, replaced by a frantic, barely legible scrawl. The ink was splotched, the letters misshapen, as if written by a hand shaking with terror. December 18th, the first entry began. They know. The Thorns know I have kept a record. The boy Jedediah saw me writing. He told his father. They came today, not for stock. They looked at me with the same eyes they use on the drifters, the same measuring gaze. They said my service was at its end. They said the final tithe is always the most personal. Arthur's breath hitched. The predator was now the prey. The monster was being consumed by the greater monster he had served. The final entry, the very last words Silas Croft ever wrote in this book, was a desperate, chaotic smear of ink. The date was smudged, but it looked like December 20th. They're coming for me. For the final harvest. My own cellar, my own creation, it is not for them. It is for me. They will not have me. The spring knows my final secret. I will not be their meat. The diary fell from Arthur's hands. The truth crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. Silas Croft was not in some forgotten grave. He hadn't fled. He had been cornered, and in his final moments, he had chosen his own tomb. The horrible final entry wasn't just a record of fear. It was a last will and testament. He now understood. The cellar wasn't just a prison for his victims. It was his own intended grave, a final act of defiance against the thorns. The question that screamed in Arthur's mind was, did he make it? The knowledge of Silas's final, desperate plan settled into Arthur like a stone. The cellar was not merely a crime scene. It was a sarcophagus. The storm had lessened to a steady, miserable drizzle by the time Arthur, armed with a renewed and terrible purpose, made his way back to the Sorrow Spring. This time, there was no hesitation. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a grim resolve. He had to see. He had to know if Silas had cheated his masters. He lifted the heavy cellar door once more, propping it open with a large rock. The stench, though still horrific, was now familiar. He held the lantern high, its light cutting a trembling path down a short flight of steep, earthen steps. He took a deep breath of the rain-washed air and descended into the blackness. The cellar was small, a cramped, dugout space no larger than a pantry. The air was thick and cold, heavy with the smell of damp earth and a more profound, ancient rot. The lantern light danced across the earthen walls, which were slick with a dark, greasy moisture. And then he saw them. Bolted into the walls at varying heights were heavy iron rings, and from them hung rusted chains, their ends pooled in the dirt like dead serpents. In one corner, a pile of filthy, straw-filled burlap sacks served as a crude mattress, the fabric stained dark with unspeakable things. This was the cage. This was where the stock was kept, where the girl from the low country and the talkative salesman and the family of 3 had waited for their terrible fate. Arthur swept the light across the floor, his eyes searching. The dirt was uneven, disturbed. He saw them first as pale, misshapen stones half buried in the grime. But they were not stones. They were bones. Dozens of them, scattered and broken. The disarticulated remains of Silas Croft's many victims, a horrifying testament to the hunger of the Thorne family. He felt a profound, soul-crushing sadness. This was the final, unceremonious resting place of those who would not be missed. His light came to rest on the far corner of the cellar, the one deepest in shadow. There, huddled against the wall, was a complete skeleton. It was curled in on itself, in a fetal position, as if trying to find comfort in the final, cold moments of life. The bones were yellowed with age, draped in the tattered remnants of what might have been a farmer's overalls. This was Silas Croft. He had made it. He had crawled into his own tomb to die, denying the Thorns their final prize. Arthur moved closer, his lantern held steady. As the light fell fully upon the skeleton, he saw something clutched in the bone-white cage of its hand, held tight against its chest. It was not a weapon. It was not a final token of past life. It was another book, smaller than the first, its leather cover warped and partially decayed by the years of subterranean damp. With a sense of sacred dread, Arthur reached out and gently, reverently, worked the book free from the skeleton's grasp. The bones of the fingers crumbled to dust at his touch. He stepped back, holding the second diary. This was the secret the spring knew. This was Silas's true final testament, hidden not in the earth, but in the unyielding grip of death itself. He had brought his confession with him into the grave, a final, damning piece of evidence waiting for someone to find it. Arthur knew, with absolute certainty, that this second book contained the full, unvarnished horror of Redemption Hollow. Arthur did not read the second diary in the tomb. He could not. He sealed the cellar, replacing the heavy bar, not as a lock, but as a marker, a headstone for the dead within. He carried the small, damp book back to the farmhouse as if it were a holy and terrible relic. He built a fire in the hearth, not for warmth, but to chase away the deep, cellar-born chill that had settled in his bones. By the flickering firelight, he opened Silas Croft's final confession. The writing in this book was different from both the meticulous ledger and the panicked scrawl of the first diary's end. This was the work of a man who knew he was already dead. It was written over days, perhaps weeks, in the cold, starving darkness of the root cellar. It was a clear-eyed account of his own damnation. He confessed everything. He named every victim he could remember. He detailed the dates, the transactions, the gruesome specifics of what the Thorne family required. And he explained the why. The Thornes, isolated for generations in the valley, had turned inward. Their pride and their paranoia had led to a cycle of inbreeding that had left them ravaged by physical and mental decay. Their monstrous appetites were born of desperation, a twisted attempt to purify their bloodline, to consume the vitality of outsiders in a grotesque, cannibalistic ritual they believed would grant them strength and stave off their own extinction. Silas wrote of the patriarch of that time, Jedediah's father, a man named Malachi Thorne, who ruled the family and the valley like a mad god. Malachi believed he was ordained by a harsh and vengeful deity to preserve his line at any cost. The victims Silas provided were not just for sport or for meat. They were sacrifices in a private, deranged religion. He described young Jedediah, not as a simple witness, but as Malachi's acolyte, a boy being groomed to inherit the bloody throne. Jedediah had not just watched. He had learned. He had participated. The entire town, Silas wrote, was complicit. Their economic survival depended on the Thorne sawmill. Their spiritual lives were governed by the Thorne-funded church. They survived by looking away, by pretending the screams from the Thorne estate were just the wind in the pines, by accepting the prosperity that was fertilized with the blood of strangers. The diary was an indictment of an entire community, a detailed map of its moral rot. Reading it, Arthur felt the last of his Boston naivete burn away in the fire. There was no simple evil here, no single monster to be slain. It was a system, a generational nightmare, where victims of isolation and dogma had become the most depraved of perpetrators. The next day was Sunday. As the sun rose, casting long, accusatory shadows across the valley, Arthur knew what he must do. Justice in a courtroom was impossible. The law in Redemption Hollow was Jedediah Thorne. The sheriff was his man, the judge's cousin. To bring this to the outside world would create a scandal, a 9-day wonder for the newspapers. But here, in the valley, it would only be met with more silence, more denial. He put on his coat, and for the last time, he walked the dirt road toward the center of town. He carried both diaries. The church bell began to toll, a hollow, mournful sound, calling the faithful to worship. He saw them, the people of the town, walking in their Sunday best, their faces scrubbed clean, ready to listen to a sermon from the man whose family had devoured the lost and the hopeless. Arthur did not go to the sheriff. He went to the church. He found Jedediah Thorne inside, standing at the pulpit, reviewing his notes, a picture of pious authority. Arthur walked down the central aisle, his footsteps echoing in the empty chapel. He placed both diaries on the pulpit, directly in front of Thorne. The old man's face, for the first time, lost its composure. A flicker of pure, animal panic crossed his eyes before being replaced by a mask of cold fury. "What is this?" Thorne rasped. "You know what it is," Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the cellar's dead. "It's your family's history. It's the town's ledger." Thorne's eyes darted towards the church entrance as the first of his congregation began to arrive. "Burn them," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "Burn them, and I will give you more money than you have ever dreamed of. You can leave this place and never look back." Arthur looked at the man, at the generations of horror distilled into that one respected figure. He saw the boy who had watched, the man who had learned, the patriarch who now guarded the grave of his ancestors' sins. "It's not for sale," Arthur said simply. He turned his back on Thorn and walked out of the church, leaving the two books lying on the pulpit open for all to see. Arthur did not stay to witness the fallout. He did not need to. The image of Jedediah Thorn's face, a mask of piety shattered by pure terror, was enough. He had not sought revenge or legal retribution. He had sought truth, and now he had delivered it, not to a distant judge or a sensationalist reporter, but to the very heart of the community that had nurtured the lie. As he walked away from the church, the bell continued its solemn toll, no longer a call to worship, but a death knell for a century of silence. He could hear the first hushed greetings of the townsfolk as they gathered at the door, their Sunday peace about to be irrevocably broken. He pictured them filing in, taking their pews, their eyes lifting to their leader at the pulpit, and seeing not just a man of God, but the two leather-bound books that contained their collective sin. He imagined the whispers, the dawning horror, the frantic denial that would follow. The poison of Silas Croft and the thorns, so long contained, was now released. Arthur did not pack. He left the dusty relics in the farmhouse, the forgotten furniture, and the brittle newspapers. He left the door unlocked, an invitation to the ghosts of the past. His work there was done. He walked the length of the valley, past the general store and the post office, past the faces that now seemed to peer from windows with a new kind of fear. The wall of silence had not been broken by an outside force. It had been made to collapse upon itself from within. He thought of Elspeth, the woman on the edge of town, the keeper of memories. He wondered if she would feel the shift in the valley's spiritual atmosphere, if she would know that the story that had poisoned the soil was now being read aloud in the house of God. He did not delude himself into thinking he was a hero. What was justice for the family of three, for the girl from the low country? Nothing could bring them back. Nothing could undo the generations of depravity. But he had denied the crime its final victory, the victory of being forgotten. He had taken the secret from the locked chest in the attic, from the cold earth of the root cellar, and nailed it to the conscience of the guilty. He reached the edge of town, where the dirt road began its slow climb out of the hollow. He paused and looked back one last time. The town of Redemption hollow sat in its basin, the morning sun still struggling to touch the rooftops. It looked the same as it had when he arrived, a place trapped in time, shrouded in mist and secrets. But it was not the same. Today, the congregation would not hear a sermon about forgiveness and salvation. They would be confronted with a testament of their own damnation, written in the hand of the man who had served their masters. Arthur Vance turned and walked away, not looking back again. He left Redemption hollow to its reckoning, to the slow, agonizing process of confronting the monster it had hidden in its own heart. He was an archivist. He had found a lost document, a terrible final entry, and he had put on the record. The rest was up to them. The silence had been broken, and in the oppressive quiet that would surely follow the screams, the real haunting could finally begin.